them. And now to begin with our first speaker, Binumol. Binu, can I ask you to unmute and turn on your screen while I introduce you? So thank you. Binumol is Dean at the Rajiv Gandhi Institute of Technology in Kottayam and Professor in Architecture in the Department of Architecture at RIT. She is a conservation architect and has vast experience in conserving historic buildings. As an author, she has published Traditional Conservation Practices of Timber Architecture, a case study of Thai Kottayam Travancore in 2007, and Glimpses of Heritage, the City of Thiruvananthapuram, published in 2011. And she's with us here today to begin our thinking and talking by talking about Jiirnnoddharana, the Hindu philosophy of conservation. Binu, welcome.
Thank you for those nice words, Peter. Good morning, everyone. The prevalent global heritage discourses are primarily Eurocentric in its origin, premise, and praxis, though we all agree upon the point that diverse cultural, historical, and geographical contexts give birth to heritage worldwide. So I think it's an opportunity for me to introduce Jiirnnoddharana, the age-old Indian philosophy of conservation, which was practiced in India and also theorized in one of the earlier traditional treatises. So why I said one of the earlier time is because what we understand as conservation as a profession started in mid-19th century, but I'm talking about this field of science, or what we call as the art of science, which was practiced in India, maybe starting from the time of temple construction and temple decay and further construction of further reconstruction as such. And India, as you all know, is a land of culture and tradition and is one of the oldest civilization in the world. It has got a culture rich and unique in its own ways. Every civilization leaves behind a legacy of footprints in the form of its rich architectural heritage. And most of the time, we regard them as mere isolated objects which are worthy of preservation. Though we understand that these are all sources of inspiration and living evidence of the physical representation of the past, rather a population having a different social and cultural past. Maybe that is the reason why every philosophy of conservation is based on the key principles of care, stewardship, as well as that of truth. Let us look at the Western world before we come to the Eastern side. So the Western world, primarily Europe, evolved the conservation philosophy mainly in the mid-19th century because of the writings of great critics like John Ruskin, William Morris, and also the practices of architects like Viollet Le-Duc. We are aware that John Ruskin, who was very purist in his thought, felt that new stones never equal the old. So there is no concept of restoring a building. To the extent he has gone stating that let the historical building die inch by inch, brick by brick, rather than retouch it, because according to him, the concept of touching a historical building and restoring it is total lie. And he goes a little more romantic, stating that we cannot call back the hands of the people who have made these buildings, and we don't have any right to touch them, because they belong partly to the ones who have built and partly to the people who are coming after us. That is a future generation. So he had presented to us a very purist thought where conservation needs to be seen and not touched. While at the same time, we had Violet Ledoux in France, who felt that stylistic restoration is good enough for replicating the reminiscence of the past, because he felt that what is picturesque today, if not attended, then it might become a memory tomorrow. And what is skillfully substituted today can weather, and then all the golden stains of time can come over it, and then it can become picturesque for the later generations. So while we had this kind of debates over conservation, in India, a slightly different viewpoint existed. In its science and art of architecture and planning, which is called as Vastu Shastra. Vastu Shastra is the ancient Indian science of architecture, and it is as old as the Vedas. Vedas are the ancient Indian scriptures which were written during 1500 to 1200 BC. And mainly they are called as Rig Veda, Yajur Veda, Sama Veda, and Atharva Veda. Architecture comes under, it's a sub-Veda of Atharva Veda. And in Vastu Shastra, whether it is designing a building or designing a settlement, it is based on Vastu Purusha Mandala, that is the land on which the mythological Vastu Purusha lay down and on which we construct our architecture. And this represents a diagrammatic and mathematical basis for design generation. In fact, we would say that Vastu Shastra is basically a genetic code that has been built with a religious background, so that architecture, the field of architecture can excel, and the people who are practicing architecture will have a genetic code to follow, so that reproducing architecture becomes easier. According to Vastu Shastra, in fact, we should compare it with modern science. In modern science, we all understand that life is formed out of the fusion of two energies, which we consider as a sperm and the egg, the male energy and the female energy, from where life originates. So in the traditional science of Vastu, it is believed that the male force, which is sown into the womb of Mother Earth, that is Prakriti. The male force, which is known as Purusha, is sown into the womb of Mother Earth, Prakriti or nature, during the process which is called Garbhanyasa, that is the foundation stone laying. And at that time, it starts getting its life and it grows up as a Vastu Purusha, or rather what we call as the superstructure of the building. The concept of Vastu relies on the fact that they have not considered the superstructure that grows out of Garbhanyasa as inanimate, as a combination of inanimate materials, but rather it is a product that comes out of creation, which is understood as Sarga Prakriya, and it happens at the time of stone laying. And then after stone laying, it takes its life and grows into Prasada Vastu. Prasada means something that gives you bliss, and Vastu is the place to dwell. So according to Vastu Shastra, it attains life and grows into Vastu, into Prasada Vastu. And here it is more metaphysical assumption, because Vastu is not understood as different inanimate materials making up a composition, but it has life in it. And especially because it develops, it is a physical manifestation of the 5 basic elements that we find in this universe and its subsystem, which is the earth, the water, the air, the light and the heat, and ether. So Vastu Shastra, according to Vastu Shastra, every building is a combination, or it's a progeny that grows out of all these 5 basic elements of our universe, and through the process of Sarga Prakriya. And since it has got life, as per Vastu Shastra, we understand that no creature is immortal in this universe, and there exists the process of creation, that is Srishti, exists the process of existence, that is Sthiti. So you have creation, you have existence, and then you have Samhara, that is destruction. So this goes on cyclically and it is continuous. So according to Vastu, it says that every Prasada Purusha, that is a building that has been built, has to undergo the 5 stages of life. And in the traditional Sanskrit slogas, especially in the 33rd verse of the 3rd chapter of Manishalaya Chandrika, which is a 16th century traditional treatise on domestic architecture in Kerala, it states that Balatva Kaumaram Yavana Madhu Vardhakyam Ta Nijanam Cha Panja Vayamsiyadanam Neshtam Shishtani Vastu Nishtani, which means that every prasada, it's a Sanskrit verse, has to go through the 5 stages of life, which is the childhood, the adolescence, the climacteric, the old age, and finally it has to reach death. That is the final stage, or what we call as decay in our conservation vocabulary. And so, since it has to undergo decay, certain structures like that has been presented to be the abode of God. For example, a temple is constructed with the intention that that temple exists till the time the universe exists. So, according to the Shastras, we are not supposed to have any destruction for temple. So, certain prasada vastu, or that gives bliss like that of the temple, would be given a rebirth. After it reaches the final stage of death, it can undergo a greening, or what we call as bringing back to life of usefulness, or rather reincarnation. And so that the abode that is built for the god is not lost. So notion of this rebirth of a building is very metaphorical, as it is the life embodied within the building that is contemplated here, not the external materials that constitute the building that has been taken as or given rather more priority. It is the life within the building that has been contemplated. And according to the traditional beliefs that the prasada for the divine, that is the religious structures, are intended to remain till the destruction of the universe, because they are of the immortal nature. We need to contribute the structure of gods as something that is immortal like the gods. So that is the reason why only these particular set of buildings come under the Jiirnnoddharana category. And now let us look at the term Jiirnnoddharana, which is a Sanskrit term. As you know, Sanskrit is mostly glosed with 1 or 2 words. So, Jiirna in Sanskrit, it means old or decayed. And Uddharana means it is a lifting up or raising up or of delivery. So this word Jiirnnoddharana, which comprises of 2 terms, can be glossed in 2 ways, like most of the Sanskrit terminology. Jiirnnoddharana, which is an ablative tatpurisha, which means that you're preventing deliverance from decay. You are not allowing the building to decay, which means that you are preserving it so that it will not undergo decay. While at the same time, it can also be understood as Jiirnasya Uddharana, which is genitive tatpurisha, which means that you're raising up of old or decayed, that is something that has gone into decay. We are restoring it and bringing it back to the life of usefulness, or rather bringing back to youth or life what is already old and decayed. So we can understand by both the meaning. At one end, it is talking about the preventive sense of conservation, where we prevent buildings from undergoing severe decay by saying a stitch in time saves 9. And at the other end, we talk about a building that has undergone decay has to be given back life, which is like giving a reincarnation to the building. So that is more restorative in sense. So if we make a comparison here with the Western philosophy, we would understand that the very same building would be preserved in its most authentic form according to our European conservation teachings as well as practice. While in Jiirnnoddharana, it is the entire essence of the building that is taken care of, and not just the material alone that is taken care of and given extension of life. So here the authenticity is more believed to be in spirit than to be in material. There is respect of life and material in both the philosophies, but here more importance is given to the respect of life, and also accordingly the respect of the process of building the building rather than the materials that constitute the building. So it is not just about the historical building alone that is found to be worthy of preservation, but the whole process of creation that gets redone while Jiirnnoddharana happens. So it means that all the traditional construction practices, the rituals, the associated craftsmanship, everything together will get redone so that the society, the process or the knowledge system of restoring a building and getting it back to life is will be strongly ingrained in the society, rather than just restoring the building, keeping up the history and restoring the building alone. But the process of restoring, process of constructing, reconstructing, everything will be very sharply ingrained in the society. And I also feel that this gives a concept a little higher than what we call as a circular economy, because all these crafts that have gone into making a particular temple or a building lies with the society. So you get a chance to revive that craft, as well as the rituals, as well as the spirit of the process. So it is the Western philosophy relies primarily on empirical evidence, which is provided by the five senses, which can literally be seen, maybe heard, tasted, touched, or smelled, depending upon the outer experiences of things, while the Indian approach highlights the spiritual way we see beyond the outer experiences and the five senses to an intuitive perception of the causes behind these outer conditions and the causes and the process that have created these outer conditions. And I must also say that the Nara Conference on Authenticity, which was held in Nara in 1995, approved the fact that since architectural marvels of architectural heritage are created by a particular culture of a particular region, it is better that we have to go more of region-centric than going for Eurocentric concepts and practices of conservation. There are a lot of traditional literature that is available. If you remember, I have said that the Vedas which were written had brought out a lot of agamas, samhitas and tantras, which give reference to Jiirnnoddharana. But the best traditional treatise which talks about Jiirnnoddharana as a single chapter, it is the 12th chapter of Tantra Samuchaya, which is a traditional Sanskrit treatise written in 1428 AD on explaining the process of temple construction. It has got the 12th chapter as Jiirnnoddharana, which has got about 38 slokas, which talks about the process of Jiirnnoddharana. But we may all be wondering whether it is a process of reconstructing the building that has been explained. No, it explains the process of the rituals that needs to be followed, and what all preconditions exist, and what kind of renovation has to happen especially for the idol, because the textbook itself or the traditional treatise itself talks about how buildings are constructed. So our forefathers have thought of referring to the construction part, because it is again reconstruction of the heritage structure rather than renovation or restoration of the heritage structure. And in addition, I must say that the 12th century Maya Mata, which is a canonical text on art, architecture and planning, describes rules to the renovation of temples, the idols, the rituals that needs to be followed, how to take care of the pedestals, the images that are there in temples, all that written as early as the 12th century. Then we have a lot of samhitas. I have mentioned a few here, Kamigagama, Ajidagama. All these traditional treatises talk about Jiirnnoddharana, but not in detail as Tantra Samuchaya talks about. So there are a lot of general principles that are followed in Jiirnnoddharana Vidhi, the system of Jiirnnoddharana, where accordingly, it is, as I said before, it is equally important as that of a new construction. So whether the building should undergo a total reconstruction, restoration, or preservation, the decision depends upon the extent of damage, like how it is being done even today, following the Western ideology. And also it depends upon the importance of the structure that is being renovated. There are a few things that would be seen as a little different from what we do in normal conservation. According to Jiirnnoddharana, the restored or renovated edifice or the building can have the same dimensions and the same materials as the original one, as per the canonical requirements, because the textbook on temple construction gives you the ways in which it has to be constructed, but it also gives a provision that the dimensions can be made larger. Like, for example, if you have a single cell sanctum sanctorum, there is a provision that it can be made multi-cell if it is required. So this is with the understanding that every society will prosper. And when our forefathers have thought that once there is prosperity in the society, and even if the building decays due to natural causes, then the building should be reconstructed with a larger dimension. In the system, it is written that under no circumstances the dimension of the restored object should be reduced or inferior materials should be used. So maybe this is to maintain the sacred significance and dignity of the building as well as its structural stability. So if you have a sanctum sanctorum, that is the central most important part, which we call as a Garbhagriha, then if it is single-storied, you can retain it as a single-storied Garbhagriha or the sanctum sanctorum, or it can be enhanced as a double-storied or a triple-storied structure based on Jiirnnoddharana Vidhi. So maybe the Indian treatises discusses a spiritual and symbolic notion of conservation of building and not the material conservation as such. This is one example which gave us a lot of profound learning beyond what has been written in the text, that when this is Chovalur Shiva temple, the temple that is dedicated to Lord Shiva in Thrissur, which has undergone restoration or Jiirnnoddharana per se, where what you see here is the circular sanctum sanctorum. When this was the roof is made out of teak wood, and the covering initially was made out of copper sheet, and later at some point of time it got transformed to clay tile. So when that was removed to check the timber strength and to change the timber parts that are decayed, to our utmost surprise, it was found that there is an additional wall plate that has been laid there, which was quite unnecessary for a single-storied structure like this. So this gave the understanding that what has been written in the treatise, that it can, once renovation or restoration happens, if you want to enhance the quality of the building, based on the principles that have been followed for new construction according to Tantra Samuchayam, then it can be enhanced into a double-storied or a triple-storied structure, depending upon the prosperity of the society. So such kind of serendipity comes out when we look into the real life conservation of temples and compare it with that of the theory that has been written in the traditional treatises. So what I would like to conclude by saying that throughout the restoration, there is a strong emphasis, even while restoration was happening in this Shiva temple, it started with taking permission from the god that we are taking up the structure for restoration, and then the energy that concentrates onto an idol because of all the prayers, is shifted in a pot of holy water, and a mini temple is constructed outside the Garbhagriha, and that energy is transferred there, and the permission is taken for 3 years. And once within the 3 years the renovation is done, the energy will be brought back to the idol and it will be put to service. And the whole process involves starting with the Garbhagriha, renovating the roof form, then looking at the wall that is made out of laterite and lime plastered, and also looking into all the rituals that goes into transferring the energy, to the extent looking at the walls and the mural paintings, which were all made out of natural colors, were redone the same manner, using natural colors as prescribed in the traditional systems, and then it has been put to use after the whole conservation process is done. So what should be intended out of this is that conservation process embodies a collective spirit, and it represents a way of living. So every structure that undergoes a renovation or a restoration will actually bring in the whole society in that community to be part of this, and then it becomes a collective spirit rather than an individual task to be done by a group of people or an agency as such. So to sum up, I must say that Western conservation thinking underpins the official and the legal conservation practice in India, and it advocates minimal intervention to historical buildings. While our Jiirnnoddharana talks about indigenous traditions, reviving the indigenous traditions through putting this into practice. And then this idolizes the opposite of what is worldwide accepted, that minimal intervention and conserving buildings to keep it in a linear pattern, while the Indian tradition is mostly based upon the cyclical nature of life, birth, growth, death, and finally rebirth, as explained in Vastu Shastra, based on the understanding or the mythology of Vastu Purusha. So Asian societies, they determine their heritage values in relation to the spiritual and naturalistic sensibilities. We must say that the Western, the authenticity of the work of art could be understood in relation to the creative process that has produced it. And then that creative process has to be preserved and safeguarded for the future generations, because as such, even with certain philosophies of redoing the structure in the same possible manner, still we know that if you look into the whole of India, there are a lot of traditions that have been found to be lost. Look at down south, the way in which the plastering is done on the floor, which gives you a mirror finished floor, everything is lost because these things have not been put to practice as it is envisaged in the traditional Jiirnnoddharana concept. So in traditional practice, each step involved in the entire research process has got a very close association with that of the culture, the belief of the people, and also the tradition that is followed by the people. So whether the rituals performed prior to intervention or after or during the process of conservation, or the entire knowledge base was always transmitted orally from guru to shishya, and later on it got theorized. So as a bottom line, I must say that it should be noticed that the traditional scholarships, as we would find in these treatises, occurs in the form of expositions or commentaries in the foundation text, but not in the form of retrospective critical studies. So it depends upon how you read it, analyze it, and put to practice is more important. And also that traditional systems emerged and crystallized within the matrix of religious beliefs and practices, the social and political scene were different, and that doesn't exist now, and a rupture has happened somewhere in between, which needs to be understood, and that has given a kind of loss in the transmission of knowledge from generation to generation, though these scriptures live still as repositories which can be used for understanding the concepts and also following the practices before they go into oblivion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now have about 10 minutes or so for questions. I'm going to keep an eye on the screen as well. Please.
Hi, Bina. It's a wonderful presentation. The question I want to ask, apropos to the meeting we're having here, is that tradition remains almost unchanged according to you. But I would say that as we live in today's world, traditions also evolve. So can you comment on the evolution, the change that has occurred on traditions, your Vastu Shastras and all that? Because, if you repeat and repeat and repeat, it just becomes a skill. It's no longer an idea. You stress the fact that conservation is about an idea, the spiritual idea. But spiritual ideas also evolve. So could you comment on that? Because, excellent presentation. I think you could give us an insight into that. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful question. Please forgive me for contradicting with you. Tradition doesn't change. Tradition remains the same because it follows a lot of canons, a lot of rules that are written. Like in architecture, we say that we have traditional architecture and we have vernacular architecture. Traditional architecture cannot change because that is based on certain principles that have been laid down practically first and then theoretically by our forefathers. While vernacular is the thing that is getting evolved, that changes based on the time frame, the climate, the change in the society. So vernacular accommodates change while tradition doesn't change. Tradition remains the same. And so what I'm intending to state is that being a conservation architect taught in the Western philosophy, it would look very dangerous if I say that all the buildings have to be reconstructed. But the whole essence is that we should respect Jiirnnoddharana and at least document and preserve the knowledge systems before the knowledge systems go into oblivion. I hope I have answered your question.
So, Bino, I have a question. In the meantime, I'll just exercise my privilege here. The first is an observation, and the second is a question. The observation is that what you present as the sort of the Indian approach that is focused on the spirit or the essence of the building was in fact also common in Europe. Even the people that you talk about, I mean, Viollet-le-Duc is a great example of somebody for whom it's actually the spirit that he is resurrecting rather than the flesh. And we could go back to people like Piranesi, who's quite articulate about that. So I think it's actually a much more common phenomenon, which interestingly enough then focuses us much more precisely on what changes by the end of the 19th century to produce the kind of distinctively European and then American approach, which is really a minority vision in the world. But the question I want to ask, in fact, has to do much more with texts. So you mentioned the Tantra Samukaya, but I'm wondering, are there other texts that contain principles of Jiirnnoddharana and also the principles of the Vastu Shastra that you mentioned? Are there texts that communicate that so that we can dig in philologically into these terms? Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Peter. I totally agree with your observation. If you look, that's why I explained the philosophy of John Ruskin in detail, where he wanted to preserve the spirit of the place, spirit of the structure, which is done here, but in a more in a different manner, where the whole process gets repeated. And regarding the text that you were inquiring, Maya Mata talks about. While I was doing a research on all the text, I found that Tantra Samuchaya, which is the traditional treatise on temple construction, has got one full chapter talking about Jiirnnoddharana. That is the 12th chapter, which has got 38 slogas which talk about Jiirnnoddharana. While if you look into Maya Mata, there are passing reference about Jiirnnoddharana, that every structure will undergo decay and so they can go back to its life. But these are passing statements, and in fact, they are just scholarships. So what we need to do is, and Maya Mata is translated in English, so it should be readable for everybody. Then many of these Samhitas, even Tantra Samuchaya, we get it, the English version. Then many of these Agamas and Samhitas also have passing reference about Jiirnnoddharana, the Indian philosophy of conservation, but not underlined as the philosophy of conservation, like how it has been given as just repositories of information.
Thank you very much. We have a question here.
Thank you for your, can you hear me? And thank you for your presentation. I think the other dichotomy is between, one is obviously tradition and modernity. The other is between theory and practice. So I was interested to know how, in your case, that theory is put into practice in architectural forms. Which are the communities which are working on these? So what is the social dimension of this application of this theory into practical forms? Do the people who actually do the work are aware of these textual traditions, or they are getting it from a derived tradition? So what is the everyday practice of these theoretical treatises? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. In fact, the priestly community, the priest of the temples, they are aware of Jiirnnoddharana mostly, but not all. So there are communities of priests who undertake Jiirnnoddharana and they do only the ritual purposes, the rituals and all those taking permission and transferring the energy, so on and so forth, all the ritualistic things. Then the involvement of a conservation architect or somebody who has done conservation, or even not per se a conservation architect as such, but people who have been doing this restoration of temples, they undertake the restoration purpose. But sad to say that it is not done completely as it is envisaged in the traditional treatise, because many of the times these temples become very rich, and they find that the temples have to be cladded with granite, and golden doors have to be fixed, and so on and so forth, which doesn't go with the knowledge system. And then when the temple becomes rich, for that matter, any religious structure, whether it is a church or a temple or a masjid, when it becomes rich, it goes anti-conservation. But there are communities of priestlyhood who are aware of Jiirnnoddharana, but mainly in terms of the ritualistic methods. And then the rest of the things are being done by experts or being tutored by experts. But the laymen who work there, some of them would be craftsmen. Like, for example, people who work on timber would be from the traditional clan of timber works. So they will be aware of how it is being done. The rest would be, join the group and then learn. Kind.
I think we are at full time. So, Binu, thank you very much for joining us. And I wish you a good afternoon.